she's staring at.
A long time ago, we looked at a game called Power Blade for the NES, which was a drastic retooling of a Famicom game called Power Blazer. And Power Blade turned out to be a pretty solid outing with some tight controls, good action, and a rather versatile main weapon in the titular Power Blade. Well, Taito eventually made a sequel to Power Blade, and the end result is today's subject matter, Power Blade 2, released in 1992 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the final game released for the series, which is a bit of a shame, but let's check the game out. Fun fact, in Japan, this game is known as Captain Saver. Not quite as funny as Scat, but hey, we're getting there, I guess. Now, Power Blade 2 is its own little game that naturally takes its cues from Power Blade rather than the original Power Blazer, and that's a good thing because Power Blade is a great little game while Power Blazer is not. Now, some folks who have played both games will opine that the second and final game in the Power Blade duology is the weaker of the two games, and that left me wondering why. Maybe it's not quite as polished, maybe it's not quite as long-lasting, maybe it's easier, or maybe it's due to the fact that Power Blade 2 is just crazy expensive these days, with a loose copy hovering somewhere within the triple digits. This is where things like this multi-cart gimmick come into play, which is what I'm using to play Power Blade 2 because it's way the fuck cheaper than the original cart, and that is a huge selling point any day of the week. Power Blade 2 once again places you in control of Nova, a super agile muscle man from parts unknown, I hate you, who's charged with the mission of destroying the so-called evil Delta Foundation, who has crafted an army of invincible fighting machines that pose a threat to national security. To accomplish this task, you'll have to traverse through 6 stages, and using your trademark Power Blade as well as 4 power suits that you'll acquire along the way, blast your way past anything that impedes your path. Much like the original Power Blade game, you could pick any of the 4 initial stages and tackle them in any order you wish. It really doesn't matter. Once the 4 stages are cleared, you get to tackle the final 2 levels of the game and put an end to the Delta Foundation once and for all. As before, your main weapon is the Power Blade, a boomerang-type weapon that can be tossed in any 8 directions and upgraded to cover more ground, hit harder, and also be able to toss multiple blades at once. In essence, it's no different from before, so anyone with a base familiarity of Power Blade 1 can jump into Power Blade 2 with no problem. As before, you can collect health tanks to restore your health at later times, and while the grenades of the first game are long gone, Nova did gain a slick Mega Man style slide ability that allows for speedy travels. But while the stages in the original game netted no real rewards beyond one step closer to the final battle, each of the 4 initial stages houses a power suit that you can earn by finding this door and defeating the dragon mini-boss within. And Power Blade 2 leans into the power suits quite heavily. Whereas in the original game it was merely a power-up that helped out a little bit, the 4 suits attained here each have unique attributes to help you progress further into the game. The Newt suit lets you climb walls and ceilings like a wall crawler of sorts, the Wet suit lets you swim underwater, the Rocket suit grants you limited flight, and the Patriot suit summons 2 orbs that will protect you from enemies. Power suits won't protect you from hits like they did in the original game, but they do drain energy, just 1 bar, and should you run out of energy, you can no longer use any of your suits, so bear this in mind. Power Blade is a much smaller game in comparison to its predecessor, not just in terms of the number of stages you play, but also in terms of the overall scope. While there's 1 less level here than in the original game, you still have 6 levels of play. However, the levels are much more linear compared to the original, which had these branching paths and invoked a bit of exploration on the part of the player. The door with the mini-boss guarding the suit is usually located halfway through a level, and it's pretty hard to miss. Power-ups are usually located at hard-to-reach places, but beyond that, these are fairly straightforward go from point A to point B affairs where you fight enemies, navigate obstacles, and eventually fight the end boss to clear the level. It's a fairly basic formula that works well enough, but feels like a step back from what you had in the first game. Power Blade 2 is something of a mixed bag as on its visuals. On the one hand, the overall graphics are a notable improvement over the first game, barring a couple of recycled cutscenes here and there. There's a little more detailed in some of the background elements, Nova is sporting a slightly newer look, and the foes you encounter are fairly menacing looking, most of them at least. On the other hand though, the levels themselves are all industrial interior settings with some minor differences in colors and some block designs and background settings. So the visual variety is somewhat lacking here, to the extent that if you were to take a bit from each level, remove the HUD, and make everything grayscale, these could look as though they come from the same level. Power Blade 2 could definitely benefit from going outside and enjoying some nice scenery, or at least some different looking scenery. But then again, based on the stage select screen, outdoors doesn't look all that appealing either, so... Meanwhile, Power Blade 2 holds its own on the sound front. Sound effects are some of the higher quality 8-bit sound effects with some punchy explosions and stuff. The music is also pretty solid, generally adopting a more darker, less upbeat slant in its compositions to match up with the more mechanical feel of the stages you're tackling. Admittedly, I prefer the more heroic sounding tracks of the first game, but Power Blade 2's tunes still hold up to the high standard you'd expect from these Natsume-developed Nintendo games. Overall, Power Blade 2 is a solid yet somewhat underwhelming sequel to the original Power Blade. The additional suits are rather nice, but the overall experience feels considerably scaled back due to its more linear and monothematic level design. Regardless, it's still a tight, challenging platformer that's worth checking out, especially if you enjoyed the first game, but I wouldn't blow hundreds of dollars on this thing. Multi-carts and or other means are your best bet, and if you don't want to go that route, then just stick with the cheaper but somewhat better first game instead. Either way, don't bother with Power Blazer, that game sucks.